Hey everybody. So today we're going to talk about colonial slavery, probably the most uncomfortable and the most paradoxical part of American history. So the first Africans arrived in North America in 1619, and we aren't sure whether these first arrivals were considered slaves, that is, individuals who were forced to spend their lives in servitude as chattel property, or were treated as indentured servants. And there is ample evidence that they were treated as indentured servants, no different than their white counterparts. The African slave trade is very old. Africans were traded into slavery from East Africa into Egypt and Asia as early as the Bronze Age. Slavery was the lot of conquered peoples in Europe, Asia, and Africa from at least that period onwards. The first European-African slave trade of the post-classical period began in 1444 when Portuguese traders acquired slaves from coastal tribes of West Africa and took them to Portugal and Spain. Slavery quickly became a racial condition rather than only a legal condition. In the ancient and classical worlds, slavery had nothing to do with race or skin color. People might become slaves because they were conquered or went into debt, or, in the Roman world, because there were more opportunities for them to become rich in Roman as slaves and later as freedmen. Another difference was that slavery was never a permanent condition for all slaves in the ancient or classical worlds. It was to become so in the pre-modern era. The European-African slave trade lasted for 400 years, during which time some 30 million Africans were taken from that continent and 15 to 20 million came to the New World. The majority went to Spanish and Portuguese colonies in the West Indies and Central and South America. By the 1650s, the slave trade was very profitable. Traders netted as much as 5,000% for their efforts. We could say that the trade was the most profitable economic venture of that, or indeed of any period. In addition to the Spanish and Portuguese, French, Swedes, Dutch, Prussians, and British all invested in slavery and were enriched by it. Slaves were generally members of the smaller tribes of inland West Africa. They were captured and brought to the west coast by Moors and powerful coastal tribes, and were there sold to whites through the Middle Passage. The Africans who sold their prisoners to the Europeans held several coastal ports, and only on very rare occasions did the Europeans themselves kidnap African people. The captives were usually forced marched to these ports along the western coast of Africa, where they were held for purchase to the European or American slave traders. The purchased Africans were usually packed into ships transporting nearly 300 humans as cargo, accompanied by approximately 35 crew. The male captives were normally chained together in pairs to save space, right leg to the next man's left leg, while the women and children may have had somewhat more room. The captives were fed very small portions of corn, yams, rice, and palm oil, normally just enough only to sustain them. Sometimes captives were allowed to move around during the day, but many ships kept the shackles on throughout the whole journey. In the passage from Africa to America, the death rate was appalling. Packed together so closely, Africans died from disease, suicide, madness, or mutiny. There were over 100 recorded cases of successful mutinies on slave ships, and who knows how many mutinies failed. We do know that slavers took out mutiny insurance at the London Coffee House, later Lloyd's of London, to protect their investments. The death rate only slowed slightly once they reached land. Slaves were worked in the West Indies for a year or two in order to season them to the rigors of the New World. The survivors were then sold on the mainland. About 18 million Africans were transported from Africa, with 3 million dying during the journey. Disease and starvation due to the length of the passage were the main contributors to the death toll, along with amoebic dysentery and scurvy causing the majority of deaths. Additionally, outbreaks of smallpox, measles, and other diseases spread rapidly through the close quarter compartments. The number of dead increased with the length of voyage, since the incidence of dysentery and of scurvy increased with longer stints at sea, as the quality and the amount of food and water diminished with every passing day. It did make some difference where the slaves ended up. In the Latin colonies, slavery was rarely as harsh as it became in British North America by at least 1660. Spanish masters were not prevented by law from manumitting their slaves, as British masters often were. In Spanish colonies, some form of citizenship followed manumission. In Brazil, there was a state official whose only duty was to protect the rights of slaves. In the Latin colonies, some days were set aside by law or custom for slaves to work for themselves. And also in the Latin colonies, slave marriages were recorded and thus given some legal status. And this was not the case in the British colonies after about 1650. On the other hand, being a slave in the Latin colonies was harsh. Along with the heat and diseases like malaria, slaves would go into mines and die by the scores. Legally, however, slaves in the Latin colonies were quote-unquote more free than those in the British colonies. In the British colonies, slaves were taught a sort of pacified version of Christianity and given a carefully edited Bible. In Latin colonies, slaves were Catholicized and observed Roman Catholic rites. So why were the Latin and British systems so different? One reason is the different legal traditions. Spanish and Portuguese law was based on the old Roman law, so when these Latin nations reinstituted slavery, they used the Roman law to govern it. Roman civil codes had fairly strict rules governing the treatment of slaves and a process in place for their manumission. Slavery was a stranger to the English common law, so it lacked institutional checks. Colonists had to make the laws controlling slavery up as they went along, and these laws became more inhumane and brutal as a result. The Catholic Church was also both a powerful religious institution and a powerful political institution in the Latin colonies. Where its interests were at stake, the Church stood between the slave and the master. The Church often insisted that marriage, a holy sacrament, be performed for slaves as much as for free persons, and that the institution of marriage be respected. This was not the case in the British Protestant churches. And the Spanish and Portuguese had a much longer history of dealing with slavery at home before colonization. The British didn't. Similarly, the Spanish and Portuguese had a longer familiarity with non-Europeans, which may have softened their views of Africans as human beings. Ironically, slavery came to North America because it offered so much freedom to Europeans. It was hard to get free people to work for someone else, and there was too much land for the taking, generally from the Indians, and too much opportunity to rise socially by independent labor. Indentured servants didn't solve the labor shortage problem. In fact, they complicated it. The first year that they were in America, they were usually so sick as to be unfit for work. The next 6 years, if they survived that long, were profitable for the planter who owned their labor. But then, once freed, they expected to be given land of their own, and then they would enter into competition with their previous employers. Slavery solved that problem. A seasoned slave was capable of productive labor immediately after purchase, and since their condition was for life, they would always produce for their master, never compete with him. British slavery began in the West Indies. It was very profitable. By 1660, blacks outnumbered whites in Barbados, and it became cheaper in some West Indian colonies to work slaves to death over 5 years and replace them than to feed and care for them adequately. By the 1660s, smaller white farmers were forced off the islands by slave labor on large plantations. Many of these small planters went to North America, especially in the Carolinas, and once settled, they wanted slaves of their own. In the North, agricultural labor of a large scale was rarely feasible. Slaves usually served as domestic servants, artisans, or artisans' assistants. By the 1650s, the major characteristics of slavery in British North America were pretty much already in place. One, slavery was a life condition. There was no option for manumission. The status was also transmitted to children through the mother. By the 1650s, the slave trade had become a regular feature of the New England merchant trade. A great deal of northeastern capital was invested in it. They bought slaves and sold them in the South. So slavery was also a significant portion of the northern as well as the southern economy. The classic system of North American slavery existed in the staple production areas of the South. It first developed in Virginia and Maryland. Punishments became worse for slaves than for indentured servants who had more legal protection. By 1649, bills of sale routinely included children, present and future, of female slaves. It became illegal for free blacks to carry weapons, serve with the militia, serve on juries, or eventually to testify against whites in court. Inheritance which passed from the father under the common laws, went through the mother in the case of a slave. So no matter who the father, the child of an enslaved mother was automatically a slave. By 1669, Virginia passed a law that stated if a master accidentally killed a slave during an act of punishment, the death was presumed to be accidental and thus carried no penalty. Who would deliberately destroy his own property? But by 1700, in colonies like Virginia and South Carolina, slavery was the major source of labor. But slavery persisted in all of the colonies, North and South, until the American Revolution, when the northern colonies decided that the institution was incompatible with the ideals of the Revolution. It persisted in the South that found slave labor indispensable. And coming up in Unit 2, we'll talk about the lead-up and the outcome of that American Revolution.